The Defense of the Faith by Cornelius Van Til. Chapter 2. The Christian Philosophy of Reality. After we answer, in preliminary fashion, the question as to what we believe as Reformed Christians, we face the problem how to get people interested in our faith. Men in general do not use or even know our theological terms, but to the extent that they are educated, they have had some training in secular philosophy. They have a non-Christian familiarity with the categories of God, man, and the universe. If we are to speak to them and win them, it is necessary for us to learn their language. There is no possibility of avoiding this. We can make no contact with men unless we speak to them in their language. Many men, in declaring that they believe in God, assume that God is identical with reality. It must be demonstrated to them that when we speak of reality, we at once make a distinction within it, namely, the reality of God as self-sufficient, and of the universe as existing by his plan, creation, and providence. This distinction in being will have basic significance for our views of knowledge and behavior. Our view of reality, or being, involves a view of knowledge and of ethics, even as our view of knowledge and ethics involves and is based on our view of being. But we cannot set forth a complete system of being, of knowledge, and of ethics. We need do no more than take a few of the main concepts of the system of theology and state them in philosophical terms. So we need to use the language of the philosophers. But most philosophers have not been Christians. At any rate, philosophical language has, to a great extent, been formed under non-Christian influence. Is it not likely, then, that we shall, if we use the language of philosophers, also import into the Christian scheme of things the problems of philosophy, as these have been formulated by non-Christian people? The answer is that we shall be obliged, to a large extent, to use the language of the philosophers, or we shall have no point of contact with them. But we shall have to be on our guard to put Christian content into the language that we borrow. The philosophers have sought for a unified outlook on human experience. Philosophers have sought for as comprehensive a picture of the nature of reality as a whole as man is able to attain. But the universe is composed of many things. Man's problem is to find unity in the midst of the plurality of things. He sometimes calls this the one and many problem. To this formulation of the problem of philosophy, we have no objection. We too formulate our conception of the nature of philosophy from our notion of the totality picture that we think we have. Quote, "It will be our business, then, to take the totality picture of Christianity and compare it with the totality picture of non-Christian thought." End quote from a book called Apologetics by Cornelius Van Til. Part 1. Eternal Unity and Plurality. The difference between a Christian and a non-Christian philosophy will appear to be basic difference so soon as we attempt to take the first step in answering the one and many question from the Christian point of view. Reread that sentence. The difference between a Christian and a non-Christian philosophy will appear to be a basic difference so soon as we attempt to take the first step in answering the one and many question from the Christian point of view. In answering this question of the one and the many, we find it necessary to distinguish between the eternal one and many and the temporal one and many. Non-Christian philosophers, on the other hand, find it unnecessary to make this distinction. We find this necessary, of course, because our conception of God as the triune God stands at the center of our thinking. We may express this thought philosophically by saying that for us, the eternal one and many form a self-complete unity. God is absolute personality, and therefore absolute individuality. He exists necessarily. He has no non-being over against himself, in comparison with which he defines himself. He is internally self-defined. Using the language of the one and many question, we contend that in God, the one and the many are equally ultimate. Unity in God is no more fundamental than diversity, and diversity in God is no more fundamental than unity. The persons of the Trinity are mutually exhaustive of one another. The Son and the Spirit are ontologically on a par with the Father. It is a well-known fact that all heresies in the history of the Church have in some form or other taught subordinationism. Similarly, we believe that all heresies in apologetic methodology spring from some sort of subordinationism. It may be profitable at this juncture to introduce the notion of a concrete universal. In seeking for an answer to the one and many question, philosophers have admittedly experienced great difficulty. The many must be brought into contact with one another. But how do we know that they can be brought into contact with one another? How do we know that the many do not simply exist as unrelated particulars? The answer given is that in such a case, we should know nothing of them. They would be abstracted from the body of knowledge that we have. They would be abstract particulars. On the other hand, how is it possible that we should obtain a unity that does not destroy the particularity particulars? We seem to get our unity by generalizing, by abstracting from the particulars, in order to include them into larger unities. If we keep up this process of generalization till we exclude all particulars, granted they can all be excluded, have we then not stripped these particulars of their particularity? Have we then obtained anything but an abstract universal? As Christians, we hold that there is no answer to these problems from a non-Christian point of view. We shall argue this point later. For the nonce, we introduce this matter in order to set forth the meaning of the notion of the concrete universal. The notion of the concrete universal has been offered by idealist philosophy in order to escape the reductio ad absurdum of the abstract particular and the abstract universal. It is only in the Christian doctrine of the triune God, as we are bound to believe, that we really have a concrete universal. In God's being, there are no particulars not related to the universal, and there is nothing universal that is not fully expressed in the particulars. Part 2. Temporal Unity and Plurality. It goes without saying that if we hold to the eternal one and many in the manner explained above, we must hold the temporal one and many to be created by God. We said above that God needed no such thing as non-being over against himself in order to define himself in comparison with it. Christianity takes non-being seriously. In discussing the question of non-being, we hasten to distinguish between God's relation to non-being and man's relation to non-being. For God, non-being is nothing in itself. For man, non-being is the field of God's possible operation. Since non-being is nothing in itself for God, God had to create, if he wished to create at all, out of nothing. It would perhaps be better to say that God created the universe into nothing. Creation, on Christian principles, must always mean fiat creation. If the creation doctrine is thus taken seriously, it follows that the various aspects of created reality must sustain such relations to one another as have been ordained between them by the Creator as superiors, inferiors, or equals. All aspects of being equally created, no one aspect of reality may be regarded as more ultimate than another. I'm going to reread that sentence. All aspects being equally created, no one aspect of reality may be regarded as more ultimate than another. Thus, the created one and many may, in this respect, be said to be equal to one another. They are equally derived and equally dependent upon God, who sustains them both. The particulars, or facts of the universe, do and must act in accord with universals or laws. Thus, there is order in the created universe. On the other hand, the laws may not and can never reduce the particulars to abstract particulars or reduce their individuality in any manner. The laws are but generalizations of God's method of working with the particulars. God may at any time take one fact and set it into a new relation to created law. That is, there is no inherent reason in the facts or laws themselves why this should not be done. It is this sort of conception of the relation of facts and laws, of the temporal one and many, embedded as it is in that idea of God, in which we profess to believe, that we need in order to make room for miracles. And miracles are the heart of the Christian position. Thus, there is a basic equality between the created one and the created many, or between the various aspects of created reality. On the other hand, there is a relation of subordination between them as ordained by God. The mechanical laws are lower than teleological laws. Of course, both the mechanical and the teleological laws are teleological in the sense that they both obey God's will. So also, the facts of the physical aspect of the universe are lower than the facts of the will and intellect of man. It is this subordination of one fact and law to other facts and laws that is spoken of in Scripture as man's government over nature. According to Scripture, man was set as king over nature. He was to subdue it, yet he was to subdue it for God. He was priest under God as well as king under God. In order to subdue it under God, man had to interpret it. He was therefore prophet as well as priest and king under God. The subordination of one fact and law under higher created facts and laws appears particularly in the notion of miracle. When Moses commanded the sea to stand aside so that Israel might go through dry shod, the laws of the physical universe were set aside at the behest of the will of man. But the subordination of the laws of nature to the will of man was in order to the subordination of the will of man to God. Using the terminology of philosophy, we may express what we have said about the subordination of one aspect of the created universe to other aspects of the created universe by saying that the lower universes of discourse anticipate the higher, and the higher universes of discourse look back to the lower universes of discourse. The mechanical universe of discourse is subject to and anticipates the organic, while the organic looks back to the mechanical. In turn, the organic universe of discourse anticipates the intellectual and moral universes of discourse, while these look back to the organic. Part 3. Sin and its Curse. To the theism set forth above, Christianity must now be added. Due to the sin of man, the curse of God rests upon the whole creation. Man has joined Satan in his opposition to God. At the same time, God has inserted a remedial influence against sin into the world. This remedial work centers in the Christ. He came forth to destroy the works of the evil one. He came to bring peace, to be sure, but the peace that he came to bring must be built upon the complete destruction of the power of darkness. Quote, I came not to bring peace upon the earth, but the sword, end quote. Such was the message of the Prince of Peace. To herald this message, he sent prophets before him and apostles after him. When most enveloped in this message, when most enthusiastic about this peace, the psalmist cried out, quote, shall I not hate those that hate thee? I hate them with a perfect hatred, end quote. When he was on earth, Christ entered into the arena with Satan single-handedly and triumphed. He is seen by John the Apostle, riding upon his white horse, conquering and to conquer. When he sees his armies languish, weary of the fight, the clarion voice bids them put on the whole armor of God. They may not waver. It is the church militant, this people of God. Only those who fight to the end receive the crown, and then there is peace indeed. In the, quote, regeneration of all things, end quote, he that sits upon the throne is surrounded by the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures. The whole creation is there. The whole creation is redeemed. No discordant voice is heard. All sing the great song of the redeemed creation. Through redemption, creation's purpose was accomplished. Where are the enemies? They are sealed in a soundproof exclusion chamber. Satan has lost the struggle. God is God. Such, then, in broad outline, is the Christian conception of being, or the Christian conception of metaphysics. We may speak of it as a two-layer theory of reality. When men ask us, what is, according to your notion, the nature of reality or being, we shall have to say that we cannot give an answer unless we are permitted to split the question. For us, God's being is ultimate, while created being is, in the nature of the case, derivative. Again, if we are asked, what do you think of the relation of the eternal to the temporal? We reply that the eternal for us does not exist as a principle, but as a person, and that as an absolute person. Accordingly, we do not use the eternal as a correlative to the temporal. We use the notion of the eternal God as the personal creator of the temporal universe. Once more, if men ask us to ask which is first, becoming or being, we reply by saying, first of all, that the term becoming cannot be applied to God. God's being is not subject to becoming. He is eternal being. And as for created being, it is in the process of becoming by virtue of the plan of God. God's being is therefore before the becoming of the created universe. The eternal one and many are prior to the created one and many. We have put the words before and prior to in quotation marks. And listeners, I didn't say that, so they were in quotation marks. It will readily be seen that if our theory of reality is true, we cannot simply say that God is prior to the universe, meaning by, quote, prior to, end quote, temporal priority. Inasmuch as God is not subject to time, we cannot enclose him in the calendar. God is the creator of time itself as a form of created being. On the other hand, if we say that God is prior to, in quotation marks, the created universe, we do not simply mean what is usually meant by logical priority. God is, to be sure, logically, quote, prior to, end quote, the created universe, but he is logically prior by virtue of the fact that he has actually created the universe with its temporal form out of or into nothing. Without the notion of temporal creation, the notion of logical dependence cannot be maintained. It will now be plain that our conception of the nature of reality goes counter to every theory of reality that the history of philosophy affords. That this is the case will appear more fully later. For the present, we wish to emphasize the fact that we can do nothing less than take the conception of reality as we find in a systematic theology that is based upon Scripture, and therewith we approach the problem of epistemology, our subject of the next chapter.